The purpose of this presentation is to give the honest, objective truth about how the EU works in practice, as there have been many myths and lies about the subject, which reached a peak during the Brexit campaign. This presentation will give you a simple and clear overview of the fundamental levers of its working, and thereby expose these myths and lies. It is split in two parts, firstly giving an overview lasting some 20 minutes, and the second part looks in more depth about the functioning of the major EU institutions, lasting about 10 minutes. It is striking to note that there is no clear explanation of how the EU works, which has been given by politicians, press and the media. A major communications deficit which has opened a boulevard for extremists to lie and distort its workings to support their populist views. For instance, saying that Brussels, namely the European Commission, decides everything, all our laws, and have taken away the UK's sovereignty. I'd like to explain the fundamental workings of the EU with this graph, which I compare to a cycle wheel with 3 circles. In the first outer circle of the tower, with the flags of the 28 member states, the latter keep control over an average 70% of their own affairs, and not the contrary, under the principle of subsidiarity. The second circle, the European Council, brings together the government heads of the member states that look after their sovereignty. It is they who set the strategy, the main guidelines and the priorities of the EU, and decide on the treaties to be established. It's the institution that has the most political authority. It's the mode of working called intergovernmental. The third circle is the European Commission in the middle. It is composed of commissioners appointed by each member state, but who are forbidden thereafter from receiving orders from them. The European Council of Heads of Government also has a key say in the appointment of the President of the European Commission. The Commission is collectively the main area of management of the EU. It is supranational and responsible for the general interest of the whole of the EU. It's the mode of working called community. So to summarise, we have our outer circle with the individual countries looking after their subsidiarity. We have the second circle with the heads of government looking after their sovereignty under the title the intergovernmental, and then in the middle the European Commission looking after the general interest, the community vision. Bottom left, the Council of Ministers, called the Council, comprises government ministers from each member state. In effect, it's the remainder of the government. Thus, the head of government is placed at the European Council of Heads of Government in the second circle, and his or her ministers in the Council of Ministers. This body looks after the interests of the member states. The European Parliament on the right, bottom right, comprises directly elected members of Parliament from each member state and represents the European citizens. Top right, I've added the other major institutions, namely the European Central Bank, the European Court of Justice based in Luxembourg, which deals with the respect of the treaties and norms, which should not be confused with the European Court of Human Rights based in Strasbourg, which is independent of the EU, and the Court of Auditors. The first thing that can strike one looking at this organisational structure is the obvious tension between the heads of government of member states looking after their sovereignty in the second circle, the intergovernmental, and the Commission with its community vision of looking after the general interest of the whole of the EU. To help us understand this organisational structure, we need to understand that it originated from a supranational model conceived by France in 1950 for the European Coal and Steel Community, which was set up by 6 European countries in order to prevent another war by combining these industries. The idea was to combine the needs of sovereignty of each of the 6 countries in the first outer circle, with the need to act in the interests of all by having a group of independent supranational experts appointed by each country collected together in a high authority in the centre, just like the European Commission today. There was a parliamentary assembly, like the European Parliament today, but it was purely consultative. There was a council, like the current Council of Ministers, but a major point, there was no Council of Heads of Government in the second circle. This model was used at the beginning of the European project in the Treaty of Rome in 1957. It's the creation of the European Council of Heads of Government in 1974 and citizens directly electing their European Parliament in 1979 which has fundamentally changed the functioning of the EU. So we can see here the structure today of the EU with its second circle, the European Council of Heads of Government and the European Parliament, which is now elected by universal suffrage. Let's have an overview to understand how laws are decided. We've already mentioned that it's the heads of government of member states who give the direction, the priorities, the impetus for the EU. Then the European Commission prepares and submits proposals. And I stress the word proposals and not decisions, because decisions are made by the governments of member states within the Council of Ministers, together with the European Parliament for almost all laws, i.e. the legislative process as per a normal democracy. But the Council of Ministers retains certain areas for itself independently from the European Parliament, for instance direct taxation and the management of the euro within the Eurogroup. Thus the management of the Greek crisis was not co-decided with the European Parliament. The laws decided by the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament are essentially of two sorts, namely directives and regulations. A directive gives the objective to be attained by the member states with a deadline, but leaves them the choice of form and method according to their national procedures. But in practice, member states add their own layers, sometimes many layers, called gold plating, which can at the end vary rather differently from the initial objective. A French example, where it was scoffed that a directive forbade 16-year-old apprentices from climbing ladders with more than 3 rungs. The original directive in 1994 simply encouraged member states to look after the protection of younger workers. The remainder was due to the French state. A regulation, on the other hand, is applied in all countries directly, which the European Commission applies, but under the control of member states, using a very complicated procedure called comitology. You often hear in the press and media that it's Brussels, meaning the European Commission, which imposes the laws. But as we have seen, the Commission can only propose but not decide upon laws. In theory, the European Commission has the monopoly of initiating legislative proposals. What then is the source of these proposals? Where do they come from? Whilst investigating the question, I learned that 85 to 95% of proposals originated outside the European Commission, which I've summarised here. First of all, starting from the top, there are the main political guidelines, the impetus, the priorities set by the heads of government of member states within the European Council. And from my latest research into this area, interviewing real connoisseurs on the subject, the European Council is involved far more in giving detailed conclusions as to what they want. The European Parliament, on the right, although not having the formal power of initiating legislative proposals, has nonetheless the power to submit special initiative rights for that purpose and doesn't hesitate to do so. To the left, the governments of member states collected within the Council of Ministers and their full-time based representative in Brussels work closely with the Commission on their proposals. Both the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers can submit proposals to the European Commission, which the latter is obliged to answer. Bottom right, there are decentralised agencies, for instance the European Aviation Safety Agency, the European Medicines Agency. There are also, on the left, lobbies of industrial sectors, NGOs of all sorts, in all some 30,000 people. There's public opinion, and also the treaties that need to be respected. Here is the flow of a proposal that has been discussed at many levels with many people and institutions, including national parliaments, before arriving at the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament for decision. Even here, if a third of the countries consider that a proposal does not lie within the competence of the EU, they could submit a yellow card to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, which will decide on the issue. Let's look now at the areas decided at EU level called competencies, which member states have decided by treaty to decide upon together at a European level, totally distinct from areas decided at member state level. This subject is covered by the Treaty of Lisbon, which sets the rules, which is the Bible of its functioning. Please note that Article 5 of the Lisbon Treaty states that the Union shall act only within the limits of the competencies conferred upon it by the member states in the treaties. Otherwise, competencies remain within member states. There are three categories of competencies. Starting on the left, an exclusive competence. When member states have decided to transfer the whole of their powers, their competencies in an area, such that member states can no longer legislate in their home countries, but everything must be decided at EU level. There are few exclusive competencies. For instance, the common commercial policy, competition, or the management of the euro. In the middle, a shared competence. Here, member states have only transferred a part of their competence, of their powers, such that they can continue to legislate alongside the EU. It's the most common case. The EU then acts in place of a member state when a joint action is considered more effective than member states acting separately. For example, transport. Member states can decide to increase or reduce these competencies. And lastly, a supporting competence. When the main competence remains within the member states, that is, the EU supports, coordinates or supplements the actions of member states, such as culture, education and vocational training, youth and tourism, but it's entirely up to the member state to decide to take part in it. To summarise, the EU only acts in those areas agreed upon by member states. To have a clearer understanding about the key subject of powers, competencies, here is a graph giving an overview as to what in reality the EU deals with, which after visiting Greece for my holidays inspired me to use the Greek Parthenon in Athens. Starting bottom right, here are the various member states using their political powers in numerous areas. They decide which powers, competencies, which building stones they wish to use to build the European edifice, the main one being the bedrock of its values. The pillars of the Parthenon represent the main areas where the EU deals with. The first pillar representing the single market with its norms and rules to stop, for instance, internal protectionism, which gives a framework within which member states are responsible to work and make a success or not of their affairs, and where the European Commission works in particular on agriculture and fishing matters. The second column is for the Eurozone, which similarly offers a framework for working within. The third pillar, with the cohesion funds, represents funds that are redistributed to poorer countries and areas within the EU to help reduce differences in wealth. The EU in the world in the fourth pillar, with its embryo of a foreign affairs ministry and the international aid programme of the EU. and the last column various. For instance, where we have bits of defence, penal policy and migration. The small blue circle top right shows the European Commission, which manages and administers the edifice, and to whom the Member States gave the thankless task of preparing its norms and regulations. A point that I would like to stress is that Member States remain in full control of their decisions, especially their receipts and public expenditure, so they only share a part of their powers, for instance, a minimum of social rights and the 48-hour week. Member States within the Eurozone also remain in control of their decisions on the economy, their taxes, their public expenditure, retirement rules, etc., but again within the limits of the rules for the Eurozone framework. Although the EU has the embryo of a foreign affairs ministry, Member States keep their respective ministers of foreign affairs. Member States can choose to progress further and share more of their sovereign powers, such as defence, direct taxation, social policy, penal policy, but need to decide unanimously to do so. So one can see in this picture that Member States decide by treaty which powers, which competencies they wish to be handled at the European Union level, and they remain mostly limited to a few key areas. This graph seeks to give an overview of the EU and shows that in practice, and taking into account the number of countries and the complexity of subjects, many directives and regulations result from detailed discussions between groups of experts from each of the major European institutions, principally the European Commission, the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament, called Trilogy, to facilitate the adoption of laws. Nonetheless, there are rules regarding transparency that need to be respected. Consequently, we have an organisational model which works more or less well, but which is effectively a model of a hybrid democratic government, because the initial model based on the Iron and Steel Treaty of 1950, with its commission of experts looking after the general interest, has been overtaken by the establishment of the European Council of Heads of Government and the voting change of the European Parliament, as previously mentioned. The Commission isn't a government in the real sense of the term, because up until the election of Juncker, the heads of government of member states, and not the European Parliament, chose its president. Furthermore, the president of the Commission doesn't choose his commissioners, as the governmental heads impose them. And unlike a government resulting from the election of a party, the Commission acts in the interests of the whole of the EU. Thus, the European Parliament doesn't have its government in power, but nonetheless has the power to legislate. Consequently, the European Parliament is obliged to act by consensus to count vis-à-vis the other institutions. A French deputy put it well, I believe, by saying that a national democracy is based on confrontation, whilst the European democracy is based on negotiation. There are also areas that are solely decided by the European Council of Heads of Government for reasons of sovereignty, for example, defence and foreign affairs. The Council of Ministers also keeps various areas of competence for themselves for reasons of sovereignty. For example, direct taxation, social policy, energy policy, where the European Parliament has a purely consultative role. To conclude, member states still maintain control of the functioning of the EU, are at the origin of most proposals and decisions, but don't take responsibility for them unless they are popular, the remainder being blamed on Brussels, the European Commission. I'd like to take this opportunity to show you a graph that I consider key to stress the importance of the EU. It seems to me that the huge growth of the world's population over the last century, and especially over the last 50 years, has not been taken into account by the Western world. In 1900, when Europe governed much of the world, 1 in 5 of the world's population was a European. In 1960, the 28 EU states represented 1 in 7 of the world's population. Today, the EU represents 1 in 14 of the world's population. And in 2050, tomorrow, the 28 EU states will represent 1 in 20, just 5% of the world's population. The biggest increase coming from Africa, which currently has 1 billion population and is set to grow to 2.5 billion by 2050. I don't see how we can hope to keep our European civilization with its values of democracy, respect of the rule of law and tolerance, to maintain our European sovereignty vis-à-vis China, Russia and the US without being united. It's for this reason that I believe that the English saying, "United we stand, divided we fall," is very relevant here. Please click on the link below right to proceed to part 2 of this presentation.